It's a great pleasure for me to be with you again this morning. Obviously, this is the third one of these events that we've run, and every time I think we're always slightly anxious that there won't be anything to talk about. But I think if this virus has taught us anything, it's that there is always new stuff coming up, and today is actually no different. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that the agenda is going to be fairly detailed. We're going to talk a little bit about furlough and the job retention scheme. We all know it's now coming to an end, but there are still some wrinkles and indeed some of the consequences of the scheme, I think, which are worth flagging. We know that since the 1st of July, we've introduced flexible furlough. It's still very early days. I know a number of you've got queries about how we calculate flexible furlough pay. This is obviously the first claim month, as it were. So I think that is still a bit of a work in progress, but I'm going to share with you some of the thoughts and information that we have today. How can I do a session like this without talking about compulsory quarantine and holidays? Those of us who've just come back from the Isle of Wight didn't have a problem with quarantine, but I can see that some people might feel that was a bit tame. So, and certainly no guaranteed sunshine. So I'm going to look a little bit about holidays, the changes and the compulsory lockdowns and effectively how that might work. We're then going to talk about maternity because, as has become apparent, the job retention scheme has certain implications in terms of maternity, and also the consequences of maternity in terms of redundancies, because we're seeing as a practical point that that's becoming very topical. And then my last commentary is going to be about what we've learned in the last 4 months, really, about how we deal with redundancies, probation and performance management in this sort of new normal COVID environment. So what have we really learned so far, and what things work and what things really seem to be a bit of a disaster? So the next slide is going to be about furlough and the job retention scheme. Pretty staggering, really, that 9.4 million employees, or employments, I think is the phrase at the moment, have been furloughed. There was a massive increase, I would suggest, as at the end of July. So a further 678,000 claims were made, because we knew that effectively, if the claims were not made before the end of June, then you would not be able to claim going forward. So that really encouraged a bit of a spike. Similarly, we know that today 1.14 million employers have used the scheme. And again, this was an increase of 75,000 during the course of June. Again, I suspect for the same reasons. And again, we know that there is an impending deadline tomorrow for all claims up to the 30th of June. If you haven't sorted out your claims to date, you're probably wasting your time on this call and ought to be trying to sort that out, because we know that there are going to be substantial changes from July with the flexi furlough. And I would suggest even more significantly, differing levels of contributions from the 1st of August as the scheme effectively winds down. We know, of course, that it winds down across all sectors and irrespective of the nature of employment. Query whether or not that will in fact happen, of course, but at the moment that's what we're working towards. Another feature which has become very commonplace in the last couple of months, certainly, is what about overpayments and underpayments? Strangely, you may find this peculiar, some clients have been overpaid, and effectively, if you think you've been overpaid, then you need to notify HMRC with your next claim. You need to keep the records for 6 years, and we'll talk in a minute about why that's so important, because that effectively ties in with the furlough and the fraud issues. But it's very, very important that those records are kept, because we know that they are going to be checked. The HMRC are also developing a process for paying back payments where no future claim is made, because another feature is that a number of clients have in fact furloughed for a short period of time, have changed their furlough arrangements, have effectively flitted between flexi furlough, rotational furlough, you name it. So it has been a rather confused picture. Underpayments, rather more complicated. If you're trying to get more money out of HMRC, it's perhaps unsurprising that there is quite a detailed process for that, and you've got to expect various additional checks to be made. So it will be interesting to see in the fullness of time whether or not any of those underpayments ever get rectified, or whether indeed people decide to run with it rather than risk some other further inquiry. And then the last note on my slide is about the furlough fraud. And you'll all have seen in the papers the chap in the West Midlands who'd been arrested earlier this month on a £495,000 coronavirus fraud. I suppose when you look at the sort of money involved, that seems quite small. But I think what is clear is that there have been a number of complaints and issues raised. Some of these I think are quite instructive. Hopefully they would never apply to anybody on this call. But certainly I think the anecdotal evidence is that some companies certainly have forced employees to work while placing them on furlough. I think particularly the training and development exemption has been somewhat abused. A number of employers have failed to tell the workers that they were in fact on furlough until they received a reduced paycheck, whilst others, certainly to my experience, have effectively been told to hold off. So rather than the furlough scheme being a reimbursement scheme, monies have not been paid until the monies have been received from HMRC, which is frankly not quite the way it's supposed to work. So we know from the guidance issued earlier this week that this is very much on the radar. So I think the key starting point is the finance bill. And under this current bill, employers that have either knowingly misused the furlough scheme or think they may have accidentally done so, and let's face it, it's quite easy to make a mistake, will be given a 90-day window to admit their mistake. This is an improvement on the previous 30 days, which I think most commentators felt was simply too short. So if you're found to have been deliberately using the money for anything other than its intended purpose, then you face a financial penalty. But you have this 90-day period to report any mistakes on claiming the grant. I think the theory being that they would prefer to do this by a method of self-analysis rather than a coercive one. Equally, though, I think it's quite clear that HMRC will be pursuing cases well past October when the scheme officially ends. It will become part of the standard payroll audit mechanism, for example. So I think now is the moment to ensure, particularly as we go into this slightly tricky period of flexi furlough, where I think there is a far higher level of a possibility of mistakes, that your record keeping is correct. So to recoup, if we look at the guidance, not only must the records be kept for 6 years, but they have to include the amount claimed, the claim period, claim reference number, and the background calculations. Particularly, I think when we're looking at flexi furlough, when we're looking at the difference between usual hours and actual hours and claiming effectively for the difference. So we know that there are going to be a number of investigations. I think we can only hope that our own businesses are not those that are found to have been wanting. So, next slide, please. Hello? Next slide. Right, brilliant. Treasury Guidance in June and July 2020, I think is incredibly complicated. But I think this is an area where you would be well advised to take the advice of your external advisors, simply because if there's a mistake, I think that will give you some comfort. And after all, we all do carry insurance. So claims starting on or after the 1st of July must start and end within the same calendar month. So, for example, if an individual was furloughed in June and indeed in July, there will still need to be separate claims. Another area that's caused quite a lot of interest is this question about the cap on the number of employees included in a specific claim. As I've already said, a number of clients have varied the number of furloughed staff over the last few months. So, for example, in one particular month there may be 30, the next 20, another month there may be 50, up to the 30th of June. In that instance, then the maximum number of claims is going to be the 50. There is, however, an exception for returners from maternity and parental leave, because they can be added, and as you're all aware, they can still be furloughed. An option not open in relation to other staff. So if we go on to the next slide, I think I've already said that we're looking at the calculation methods, and the guidance is the working out the usual working hours, recording the actual hours, and then working out the amount to which they were furloughed. And the process seems to be very much designed on a monthly basis, which can be difficult because from our own experience, we know that a lot of the flexible furlough to date has been very much on the basis, for example, of a split week. So individuals have now come back, say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and are furloughed for Thursday and Friday. This can, however, have quite a strong impact on the calculation method. So again, I would very much refer you back to your payroll provider and the accountants, because I think that they will need to resolve it. I suspect that after this first set of claims have come in, so the claims as at tomorrow, the 31st of July, then we will probably get some clearer guidance, or at least some better worked examples. Other problems, I think, are where individuals are bringing people back on flexi furlough to cover, for example, holiday leave. And they seem to be a bit more straightforward to me because individuals are effectively working solid weeks. Rotational furlough arrangements. This was really a pre-flexi furlough methodology, and it effectively works on the basis that one group would be furloughed for a certain period of time, usually 3 to 4 weeks, and then another group would come in. If individuals have been furloughed on the 22nd of June, then they stay furloughed until the 11th of July because of this 3-week rule. Only at that point, therefore, can they be put on the flexible furlough scheme. So I think one can imagine that the claims for this particular month for that particular group could be quite complex. Again, I think in terms of the impacts on holiday pay and notice calculations, we know that individuals are entitled to be paid 100% of pre-furlough pay in relation to both these elements. However, clearly those calculations will become more complicated if in fact there is an element of flexi furlough included as well. Again, way beyond my pay grade, but something that will need quite careful checking. Does seem, however, quite clear, contrary to a slight firmer, if you like, at the start of July, that individuals will be able to work their notice whilst on furlough. So the employer will be able to get that contribution, even though the individual has been told that their employment will end. There is, of course, no provision for any contribution from furlough where individuals are paid in lieu of either the holiday or indeed the notice. And then the last point on the slide is really about this whole question of temporary or a permanent reduction in pay. We know that at the time the virus hit, or shortly thereafter, there were a number of temporary reductions in pay. Again, I think this has become really even more complicated now. You will notice that in a lot of the original furlough letters, the implication was that an individual would either be working or indeed on furlough. And if they were on working, then the temporary pay cuts would take effect. There wasn't really any expectation that there would be this other option in terms of flexi furlough. So if you haven't already done it, we obviously need to make sure that our letters are updated to provide for the possibility that individuals may come back on a flexi furlough basis. If they do come back on a flexi furlough basis, then there is an issue about the extent to which, for the days they work, are they working on their pre-furlough pay or are they on the temporary reduction? So quite complicated in practice, potential for quite a lot of internal strife in relation to this, because it may be that an individual who has been furloughed and returns on a flexi furlough basis will actually be better off than an individual who has worked throughout and is taking the benefit or the disadvantage, shall we say, of the permanent pay cut. Normally in the region of 10 and 15%, much more than 15%, there seems no incentive for people to work at all. So moving on from flexible furlough, and I'm sure we will come back to this at some point in a future webinar, then wanted to talk about holidays and compulsory quarantine. I think the government has been criticised for a whole range of different issues, but one of those issues undoubtedly could not be said that they were not clear that you would not get statutory sick pay if you were coming back. I think that Mr. Raab wanted employers to be reasonable, but nobody was quite clear what reasonable in this context meant. But it was then apparent that there would be no statutory sick pay payable. So there is obviously a discretion to pay during quarantine. Query whether or not your policy allows for some sort of unpaid or partially paid. Very unlikely, it seems to me, that any of these policies, unless they've been written in the last month or so, would ever have envisaged a situation of this type. I think it's important to look at the flexi home working, because obviously those home workers can continue to work during quarantine, whereas those individuals who are required to attend the office or the factory or the business cannot. I think it's quite important to look at whether or not any element of the role for an individual who's quarantining can be done from home, and whether or not they can at least be paid for that proportion. But I do appreciate that that is quite a complex exercise. I think there was also a suggestion in the press that short servers who came back and had to compulsorily quarantine were at risk of dismissal. I think that's a pretty unlikely. outcome. I've put on the slide about being beware of protected characteristics. So clearly, we need to be reminding our colleagues that some rights, for example, protection against discrimination of all types, are a day one right. I think our general view is that to dismiss somebody who effectively went to Spain in good faith and then finds they have to compulsorily quarantine on the way back would seem extremely harsh and unreasonable. So we're not really recommending that as a course of action. Of course, going forward, and I've put this on the slide, it does seem important to develop a fair policy to cover future lockdowns, and certain clients were already looking at this back in May. So, for example, if I operate a branch network as well as a head office function, it was perceived as unfair that the branch staff would therefore not have that ability to work from home, so would be victims, if you like, to any quarantine, whereas the home workers could continue. So I think it is really important to develop that fair policy to try and reach some type of balance between different staff. So what are the options really for employers? Because as you can imagine, we've had quite a few queries on this particular week. Well, obviously the work from home option, whether or not they can work from home in part on the basis that they can be paid at least in part, which is obviously better than nothing. I think the unpaid leave, which is undoubtedly the request that many employers feel they've got no option to do. There's also the option of allowing individuals to relax their holiday policy and allowing employees to take remaining holiday on return to cover some or all of the period of quarantine, even if they cannot give the normal period of notice, and also the fact that they can, that may cause further problems down the track, as it were. Also, of course, many employers have a rule that you cannot take more than 2 weeks off in school holidays. So that also would have to be relaxed. It definitely is an option. I think it gets around some of the earlier concerns that individuals will be stockpiling huge wadges of holiday, so holiday up to March 2020, and indeed going forward. Query whether or not in practice, though, that this is actually going to be effective. And again, I think there is a dismissal argument, and we have a specific question in relation to that. Obviously, if an employee is unable to turn up for work, then that would be a potentially fair reason for dismissal. I think there is a distinction between somebody who deliberately goes on to holiday to a country where the quarantine rules were already imposed as at the date they left. However, you would still need to show it was in the band of reasonable responses, and I think our view is that that could be very, very tricky. I think our focus is very much on what can employers do to clear up the confusion. So we're only 2 weeks into the main school holidays, so what other action could be taken? So some type of policy, or at least some sort of staff update, so that they understand the implications if they do holiday abroad and are asked to self-isolate afterwards. We often don't know where our employees are going on holiday, particularly in these days of the remote working and being based from home, so there's no water cooler moments. Possibly include an obligation to inform the employer they've travelled abroad, the name of the destination, the duration of their absence. I think this is quite important if you know somebody has come back from abroad, chooses not to quarantine because they're not paid, whether that would be a fair reason for asking them to stay at home. So again, I think that these are all issues which will need to be worked through, but are definitely worth thinking about now, because it seems quite likely that these future lockdowns on compulsory quarantines are going to be a feature going forward. Next slide, please. Key point is about maternity. We know, unfortunately, that we are looking at a number of redundancies exercises, probably more than I've ever seen in any period of my career. And as part of that, clearly this whole issue of individuals who are on maternity leave and approaching maternity has become very prevalent. Because if I'm reducing my staff, how do I deal with this situation where an individual is in a couple of months likely not to be available for work? So there are particular issues: qualification, maternity pay, maternity allowance. And the norm is to calculate this for the statutory scheme on normal average weekly earnings in the 8 weeks leading to the expected week of confinement, that lovely Victorian expression. Where the maternity leave begins after the 25th of April, If they're furloughed, then the maternity pay is calculated by reference to the pre-furlough pay. So far, so good. If, however, of course, the individual has not been furloughed, but has effectively agreed a temporary pay cut, say 15%, then in the absence of any other agreement or understanding, the maternity pay will be calculated on the basis of that reduced pay. So the exception only applies if you've been furloughed. If you've not been furloughed and you've agreed a reduced pay sum, then that is the basis. Now, a number of clients feel that is unfair. And indeed, as a business ourselves, as a firm at Keebles, we decided to take the view that all maternity leave would be calculated on the basis of the pre-furlough or pre-reduced salary, even though in relation to the pre-reduced salary of the staff who weren't furloughed, we will be meeting that cost ourselves. Another specific issue relates to contractual maternity pay, where, for example, a new individual may get 50% of normal pay once the first 6 weeks has expired. And again, in the absence of any other agreement, that will be on a reduced figure. So you can see where some of the concerns have been expressed that the implications and the impact of COVID fall particularly heavily on this grouping. Next point is really self-evident, but I think it's worth highlighting. Maternity redundancy selection. Maternity, surprisingly enough, is unlawful as a basis for selection. But pregnant individuals and indeed staff on maternity leave can still be redundant if there is a genuine redundancy situation. So great care needs to be taken to guard in relation to this, because there is a huge temptation, I can see already from my own experience here, that people will be very keen to lose some of these maternity leavers. It may be keen, but I think it does run with it some fairly huge risks. And then, of course, maternity and the right to return. I've already said that maternity returners, and indeed parental leave returners, can in fact be furloughed. They're an exception to the rule that you had to already been furloughed as at the 30th of June. Various options apply. One is about the use of extending maternity by holiday, which obviously has the benefit of reducing the amount of holiday that needs to be taken. I think this has certain attractions because obviously a number of individuals who've now recently gone on maternity leave were not able to take any of the accrued holiday due to COVID. So I've already got a great big wodge of leave, plus they're going to acquire that maternity additional holiday whilst they're on maternity leave. So you could be looking easily at 2 to 3 months in some cases. So I think that needs to be addressed and dealt with. I know there will be an attraction among certain of you to just pay in lieu of that. That is, of course, a very pragmatic and often welcome approach, not strictly ratified or legal, so needs to be considered in the round. And then I thought it'd be useful just to talk about what this right to return is, because all throughout this process we've seen huge developments in terms of employment law provision, but in fact all the existing provisions, particularly in relation to maternity, continue unaltered. So for ordinary maternity leave, so the first 26 weeks, they have the right to return to the same job, unless, of course, there is a redundancy situation. For additional maternity leave, and I think statistically the vast majority of individuals now take more than 26 weeks, then they have the right to return to the same job. But if this is not reasonably practicable, they have the right to return to a similar job on similar T's and C's. And we're already seeing quite a lot of dispute, if you like, about whether or not there is the same job available or whether it's a similar job. Because clearly, over the course of maternity leave, things change. Anybody who's been on maternity leave in the last 6 to 9 months, things have changed massively. And particularly the sort of redistribution of duties has created in practice a number of difficulties. So it is worth thinking that for these longer maternity leavers, that the obligation is about either the same job or, more likely, the similar job on similar T's and C's. So definitely worth bearing that in mind. And of course, currently no right to return on a part-time basis. That is a new provision. There is always the right to ask. So next slide, please. I said at the beginning, over the course of the last few months, we've obviously learned an awful lot about how to manage in this particular environment. So I thought it would be handy as a last slide, really, just to talk about what we've learned so far. I think the grievances and disciplinaries have still continued to take place. I think, generally speaking, the ACAS guidance said that all we needed to do was to ensure you comply with socially distanced measures, and that has largely worked. One slight concern, I think, that is becoming apparent is that there has been an increased prevalence of recording. And I think the data protection and the Commissioner has made it clear that this has to be in accordance with the dreaded GDPR, which has not been suspended by either our exit from the European Union or indeed COVID. So that talks really about proportionality. And in this context, I think it's about whether or not the recording is securely handled and also disposed of. I think that there will be a number of issues that have arisen as a result of COVID. I think there is a heightened sense of awareness and discontent in certain offices, but there is an awful lot of lots of concerns, really, which are coming to pass. And there's no doubt about it, carrying out socially distanced disciplinaries and, to a lesser extent, grievances has raised a number of concerns. Again, probation and performance management. A number of individuals who were, let's say, whose probationary periods have expired during lockdown. This clearly needs to be addressed. You cannot demonstrate that you've satisfactorily completed probation when you haven't actually been very much at work. So clearly needs to be looked at, as does the whole issues of performance management, and that an extended period is provided for. If you don't have the right to extend your probationary period, any rewrites of the contract need to include that discretion on the employer's part to extend it. But I think our view is, even if you don't have the express right, it is a prudent method to take. The only concern we would have about that is where, either in terms of probation or perhaps for slightly longer periods, so a year plus, for performance management. If the individual is approaching the 2 years, it is probably worth taking a bit of a risk now and trying to see if you can improve, or if you can't do any conscious management, it's probably not a time to start taking risks, because we know that after the 2 year period, then those individuals have acquired mainstream employment rights, and that at that point it will be very difficult probably to dismiss them, and that the extension, so the fact that there was a COVID and they weren't at work for 6 months, will not make any difference in terms of whether or not they have passed probation and or they have passed any performance measurement you've put in place if you don't extend it. So something to look at. And then finally, remote handling of redundancy consultation. A couple of points to make on that. One is that trade union representatives who are furloughed can still take part, and that does not count as work. They don't have to be flexi-furloughed, for example, to consult with. Similarly, employee representatives can be appointed, and indeed have been, and have dealt with things on a remote basis. Not a mad fan of the Zoom call with 100,000 plus people. What we find is that remote handling via email, mixture of different methods such as Team and Zoom, with socially distanced face-to-face, seems to work very effectively. The only practical consequence we find now is that everything takes a lot longer. So, at that point, if you look at the next slide, this is why it really shows that you've got a teenage child, really. This is the end we would suggest for the summer. We hope we will do more events in the autumn, and we hope we will be able to resume business as usual. I can't promise never to talk to you again about any of these sort of furlough COVID-related schemes, but hopefully things will be moving now onto a new phase. And when we talk about some of the questions, I think you'll find that our focus is very much on that return to work and what the new normal will look like. So on that point, I'll hand back over to Chris and the questions.
Thanks, Catherine. Really informative, as always. Can see it's very interesting but very challenging times for business and HR out there. On to the questions then, which I think you cover, but sort of we can delve into and pick into the detail a little bit more. So first of all, if an employer requests to work from home on a part-time basis and work from the office on a part-time basis, is the employer responsible for ensuring that they have the right setup at home for work as well as the right setup in the office, e.g. undertaking 2 sets of DFC risk assessments, providing 2 sets of IT equipment, furniture, etc.? Is there anything else that they need to consider here?
There are a lot of points to this question, actually.
Yeah.
The first thing is, if we're looking to request to work from home on a part-time basis and work from the office, then ordinarily that would be a flexible working request. And forgetting about the COVID angle, all the same considerations that would normally apply, such as can the role be done on this basis, any additional costs, would all be relevant factors. I think there's a distinction between somebody who requests to work on this basis due to underlying health conditions and somebody who requests to work on this basis because that suits them better. Obviously, as I've said before, really, all the rules about so those flexible working rules still apply. So it is still perfectly possible to refuse that request. If an individual has been working on this basis, however, for several months very effectively, it is going to be pretty difficult to reasonably refuse that request. But it is, in theory, still possible. If we go to the second part of the question about this issue about the right setup, you've got the obligation as the employer to provide a safe place and safe system of work. That, again, is unaltered by COVID. I know we all bounced into working from home and our bedrooms and all the rest of it, but I think going forward, there is that obligation, and it's very important for the employer to check that they can demonstrate that they've complied. So if we look at the risk assessments, undoubtedly there needs to be risk assessments for work done at home, and the individual has to have the facilities, if you like, to work in a safe fashion. Not sure about the 2 sets of IT equipment. I would have thought a laptop which can be docked in the office and indeed used at home and docked at home would be sufficient. There are particular doubts about whether or not you can provide, for example, a desk, monitors, chairs, because hitherto the rule has been that that incurred a tax charge unless it was for the sole or substantial business use. The rules in this current tax year appear to me to have been a bit relaxed. So if you were going to try and set people up from home and provide a lot of equipment, this is probably a good time to do it, rather than the general rule, because obviously once you get into incurring tax charges, it becomes very problematic. For me, I think it would be different whether or not you're dealing with it on a temporary basis or on a permanent basis. I'm also not sure personally how effective this sort of split really works. If an individual's a designated home worker, for example, then tax-wise it may be better for them to be full-time at home, working occasionally in the office. I think the complete 50-50 split is probably, from an employer's perspective, the most expensive option. So something you would need to think about. But in summary, 1, all the normal issues about permanent changes apply. You could, of course, agree on a short-term part-time basis. And similarly, you are still under that obligation. So I know that a number of risk assessments have been carried out remotely and online. So I don't think you need probably to do a physical risk assessment, but you need to be able to demonstrate that you have carried out some sort of online assessment and made further inquiries if required. So sorry, lots of questions, long answer.
The next question is on similar lines, but slightly different slants. But I will ask it. And what are the key differences for us as employers between allowing people to work from home, but still keeping an office desk available for them, and moving to full home working?
I think that if they're designated as a full-time home worker, that is a permanent contractual change. You could agree it, of course, on a temporary basis. So I noticed some of the banks have agreed that nobody will be coming back until the new year. So that will be a temporary change. I think keeping the office desk available for them ensures that you keep that double cost. The problem, of course, with COVID is that whereas before the answer to this would have to be go to a hot desk solution, I think there is a view that a hot desk solution in this context is not appropriate for health and safety. So I think it is about their designation. If they're designated as home workers, then they need to be set up as home workers and treated as such. If we're in a hybrid on a permanent basis rather than the current temporary arrangement, then I think that's perfectly feasible, but it does have quite significant additional costs. So query how attractive it actually is in practice, certainly from the employer's perspective. What I don't think you can do, though, unfortunately, is the hot desk solution at the moment. I just think that is too high risk and breaches all your obligations in terms of safe place, safe system of work.
Okay, thanks. Next one, if we elect for a 6-month temporary working from home period throughout the winter with only occasional visits to the office, what do we need to do contractually and what consultation should we go through?
The first thing you need to do is you need to look at your contracts. And most modern contracts will say that your designated place of work is X, but we can require you to work from other locations within reasonable travelling distance. So long as you've got that provision in your contracts, then you can advise the staff that you need them to work from home temporarily for that 6-month period. If you don't have that provision, then obviously this is a potential contractual change of a key term. So the start point is obviously to try and do it with consent. If that doesn't work, however, and you're looking at more than 20 people, then you are in that collective consultation zone, unfortunately. So you would need to do both individual consultation and consultation with the unions and the employee representatives. Our experience at the moment, though, is that where individuals have been requested, if you like, to work from home, subject to the provision of adequate equipment, normally laptops and some type of docking station and monitor, that most individuals have been happy to agree that because of the cost savings. Don't forget as well that it's possible to make this claim for either a claim for additional expenses supported by receipts and or a claim via HMRC in relation to small ongoing costs. I can't quite remember what exactly the figure is, but your payroll team will know this. Again, I think most people have been happy to do that. There will always be some people who are never happy with anything, but if we try and go for the broadest consensus, then either we rely on the contract if we have that provision. If not, we then go through some sort of consultation exercise.
Okay, so the next one you touched upon in the slides, but specific question on holiday. So this scenario, in June, an employee asked about taking leave whilst on furlough, and at the time, HR advised if they wanted to travel abroad, they should request this in the normal way. In July, a month later, they had a call from HR asking them. Talking about their ending of furlough leave in a few weeks. However, they were currently abroad on a holiday visiting family. The employee has agreed to end their unofficial holiday and return back to work when they require them to in August. But can you request that the unofficial holiday they have taken be taken from their leave entitlement and paid at 100%, seeing that they advised them of this in the first instance, just that it was never disclosed?
I mean, my take on this is I think this is really a misconduct issue, because just as all the employment law legislation continues apace, similarly, all our policies in terms of holidays and holiday leave requests have continued, notwithstanding individuals having been furloughed and or being on COVID. But you're in an even stronger position here because, in fact, the specific conversation took place. It would be fair to say for some businesses, it has been a bit out of sight, out of mind. And I would have slightly more sympathy with an employee who effectively has had minimal contact than I would with this particular individual. So for me, I think it's a potential misconduct issue. And certainly, I think this idea that they should really be, that should be taken from their leave entitlement. Personally, I think that would be a reasonable request. And something I would certainly suggest that they, never mind requesting, I'd be tempting to instruct them, given they've taken the unofficial holiday, that they are in breach of our policy, and that we are considering taking disciplinary action, but at the very least, we think that they should be deemed to have taken that holiday, and they will be paid accordingly. So I would definitely go for that, because I think that is an abuse of the system.
Great. Okay. So now on to some questions from the Q&A box at the bottom. So firstly, would the advice for this be consistent approach to all if some can and some can't work from home?
I think that as I said to you, I think in my talk, I had one particular client in May who was very exercised about this because they were very concerned that the head office staff could work from home, so they could go ahead and book holidays, safe in the knowledge that if quarantine was required, it would unaffect them. And that their branch staff, however, if they did that, would find themselves in some difficulties. So they agreed a blanket policy, effectively, so that they would pay for the first 7 days of quarantine in circumstances where somebody in good faith booked the holiday, went away, and the rules changed. So though I think people seem a little surprised at the speed with which it's happened this week, clearly, as far back as May, it was apparent this was a potential problem. As I said, I think if there's anything that the staff can do from home, even if they're not normally designated as home workers, then that is obviously an improvement. But for me, I think it's about you either accept that there's going to be a lot of muttering and discontent because some people will be at home not paid and other people will be paid. Or, and this is our preference, you agree a policy. So, and I think the policy probably something on those lines. So with the first 7 days, if you're quarantined, you would get paid for. And then the next 7 days would be unpaid leave, or you could use some of your additional holiday. Because that is treating everybody the same. Unfortunately, in this environment, everybody is not the same. And in all businesses and all organisations, some people have had to work, which is just unfortunately a factor of the roles that they perform. But I can see why that can cause some discontent. So for my preference would be to have a cross-the-board policy which would be clear to everybody how they're going to be treated. Now, of course, if you do that, that means that the individual who could have worked from home is in fact not disadvantaged. Well, they are disadvantaged, or you're disadvantaged, because they won't be carrying out any work for you. They'll be being paid for a week, and they may, on my example, not being paid for the second week, but they won't be working. Now, for some clients, that would be fine. For other clients, however, I'm sure that they would not be happy with that, and they would rather ride out the discontent on the basis that life is not always fair, and it hasn't been fair to date. Okay. But policy is best, and communicating that policy so that when people book these holidays, they are clear about how they're going to be treated when they come back.
Definitely. Okay. If our office is COVID secure, can we now require employees to return to work even if they say that they have childcare issues? School-aged children, as we know, so school holidays at the moment, and usual circumstances, they would have childcare arrangements in place, but not at the moment.
I think this is incredibly difficult because a lot of people's childcare arrangements were very much tied in with their parents, who often tend to be shielding, and things are not yet back to normal, are they, in that regard? It seems to me that I think it's about communication, and it's about splitting it. So if it's a couple, it would be they may very well have to try and agree with both separate employers a system whereby that leave is shared. A really tricky situation. I think for most clients, I wouldn't quite say they've taken the line of least resistance, but it's been effectively, well, unfortunately, you'll either have to use your holiday, or you can have a temporary alteration to your job. So whereas you're working 4 days, now you've only got to work 2 days. You only get paid for 2 days, but you can change it. And then at the end of the holidays, we'll go back to the norm. So I think there are lots of different approaches. Another approach would simply be to say, well, if you can't work, then obviously, fortunately, you'll have to stay at home. You obviously do have the right, with children under 18, to a finite period, I think it's currently 4 weeks, of unpaid leave in terms of dealing with your children. And you also, of course, have the ability to take emergency leave to deal with unexpected childcare issues. I don't think the school holidays, however, can really be characterised as an unexpected childcare issue. But I know that could be used, for example, for several days, perhaps at the start of the holiday, whilst alternative arrangements are put in place. So there is a plethora of different leave options, some of which are paid, most of which are not, all of which would need to be explored.
Okay. Next question. We've got quite a few coming in here. Please, can you just clarify maternity returners? You mentioned a right to request part-time, but no right to return part-time.
Yeah.
Is this still as per flexible working requests, or has something changed with regards to this?
No. It's a reiteration of the existing law. I think some people think that they have the right to return part-time. They do not have the right to return part-time. All the right is currently is the right to request flexible working, which is not the same as getting it. So that's the only point I was going to make. There haven't been any changes. And it's probably more difficult now to accommodate some of those part-time requests than it was pre-COVID, just because of the impact elsewhere in the workforce.
Okay, next question. If a health and safety workplace assessment is being undertaken now and the environment is not going to be suitable, so request to work from home is refused, will grievances be made for asking the individual to work from home without having had a risk assessment at the start of lockdown, or maybe ill health, back problems, others anticipated?
I think this is really difficult. I think because of the way we moved into lockdown, it was very, very hard for clients and organisations which had not had a lot of home working. They didn't have those risk assessments in place. Totally different for a business where individuals are working substantively or 100% of the time from home. But where individuals have occasionally worked from home, there probably were never any of those sort of risk assessments in place. Query whether there should have been, but the practical fact is there weren't. I think that's why now, I mentioned in the slide, I think it's important that some of these online tools that you can find, and if anybody, there are several regulatory providers that can give you this sort of facility pretty cheaply and quickly. And that means that individuals fill in the questionnaires and they just check to make sure, and that flags up whether or not there are any things that need to be further considered. Particularly things like the provision of chairs, monitors, and whether or not they've got an accurate workplace. So one of the questions that's asked is, where do you do this work? I think my own view about it is that if you cannot create a COVID secure workplace for all sorts of reasons, particularly when you're dealing with vulnerable individuals, then it is a reasonable instruction to require them to work at home, given the appropriate tools and safe system of work. And I think anybody who objected, I think, would struggle. There have been, I know though, a number of grievances raised on the basis that individuals, particularly with mental health issues, find that they cannot work healthily from home. Unfortunately, I think it's a bit of a balance. If they can't work healthily in the office, then the home is probably the best of two bad options. But I do think it's a reasonable instruction. Even if you haven't got a specific risk assessment for the home, I think you've got to try and get a risk assessment in the ways that I've suggested. But if you are clear that your working environment is not COVID secure, then it is better for them to be at home.
Thank you. Can you claim some allowance or tax back for working from home?
Yes, you can. You need to speak to your accountants. And for the current tax year, there has been a relaxation, as I understand it, of the rules about claiming for capital equipment, so laptops, and also this sort of sole and majority use of desks and chairs, which has been a problem, I think, in the past. And there is also the opportunity where individuals have incurred additional expenses, that those can be reimbursed, but also that you can claim that tax back. And there is this ongoing allowance, but as I say, I can't quite remember at the moment exactly what that allowance is, but afterwards I'll let Chris know and then I'll tell everybody how much it is. It's not life-changing, but it's probably better than nothing, and it's payable without any proof at all.
Okay, lovely. Okay, not the final. If we allow working from home, an employee asks that they would like to work from home, but from their home country, town, Prague, implications, tax, what to consider, what are the dangers?
Well, the start point is we know that, for example, I think there was a case last year which made it clear that although the individual was the finance director and was working in Sydney in Australia, that she remained a UK employee for the purpose of bringing an unfair dismissal claim, which was quite interesting. I think there are specific issues about the payment of salaries and whether or not we have EU countries, and also whether or not we have reciprocal tax arrangements, maybe a number of implications for the individual employee. And there was a piece in the Sunday papers about people who are actually working from France or Greece, whether or not they then become French or Greek taxpayers, and whether or not, in fact, the companies are deemed to have set up locations in those offices in those locations and are also taxed. So you would need some specific tax advice on it. I think the practical issue about it is the extent to which the individual is required from time to time to come into the office and or be available to clients. I think it really depends a bit on what the role is. and whether or not that is something that can work. I think for some clients, they've had issues with time zones. It's obviously not very convenient if I am in Australia and trying to manage and service clients back in Sheffield, for example. So it must be a lot nicer weather. So I think it is possible. I think you would need to think about it. I think there are some significant issues, though, in terms of the tax, which would need to be explored for the individual and for the company. And also whether or not it is actually feasible. And if I agreed it, what I would do as a minimum I would agree it on a temporary basis and subject to a review. So I probably would agree it possibly for 3 months, but reviewable thereafter, and with the expectation that in the fullness of time, they would be coming back to being based in the UK. But it is a bit about what the role is and how practical it is to do it from abroad.
Yeah, okay. So what we were talking about earlier, this is the final question. If an employer is not paying the working from home expenses, will that person be able to claim independently?
As I understand it, you can bring a claim and you can put it on you, but you need to submit a tax return.
Okay.
And it will be a question of documenting the date at which you started working from home and the date at which you finished, or if it was ongoing, the statement of facts. So you probably need some sort of evidence from your employer that that's what's actually happened. And you would need to keep your receipts.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I think that probably rounds up everything for today. Thank everybody for joining. I know you're hugely busy. I just can't imagine, with a whole host of issues arising from this situation. Hope these updates have helped. Catherine mentioned this has been our third session that we have run each month. We're thinking there will be a pause now while we get through the next phase, but picking up again probably in the autumn. Any feedback on this, though, greatly appreciated.
But thanks again, Catherine. It's been brilliant. I hope I'd share everyone's views on that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everyone. Nice and sunny. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.